everyone. Welcome. I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm the founder and CEO of TechEquity Collaborative. We are just waiting for the room to fill up. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, everyone. For those of you who have just joined the Zoom, I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm TechEquity's founder and CEO. We are just giving the room a minute to fill up, and we will get started in just a few seconds. Okay, great. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Again, if you just joined us, I'm Catherine Bracy. I'm TechEquity's founder and CEO, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Jen Pahlka, who is my former colleague from Code for America and the author of Recoding America, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But first, for those of you who are new to TechEquity, quickly just want to share who we are. We're an advocacy organization based in the Bay Area, and our mission is to ensure that that the tech sector, tech companies, and their products and practices are creating economic prosperity for everybody rather than driving increased inequality. And we envision a world where the tech industry is responsible for building widespread economic prosperity and is also held accountable for the economic harms it creates in our communities. And we do that in two main issue areas that we think are the most impactful for everyday people's economic health, and that's housing and workforce and labor. And we do three things, one of which is quite relevant for today. But first, education and research about the issues that we mentioned at the intersection of economic equity and the tech sector. We advocate for policy and regulation. And also, critical for the conversation we're about to have, we focus on the implementation and enforcement of those laws that we're helping to get passed. And we do that both with through government and also with tech companies. So on that implementation and enforcement piece, well, actually, first, before I get to that, I think we have a couple of housekeeping notes. We do enforce a code of conduct at all of our events. Herman Calderon, who is in our chat, should be sharing a link to the full thing if you want to give it a read. But basically, it just says, you know, we try to create a safe space for learning. We want everybody to be respectful of everybody's point of view. We do leave the chat open for all of our webinars, and we trust that you will engage in conversation with each other, but do so in a respectful manner. If you have questions for Jen or for me, you should put those in the Q&A feature. Don't put them in the chat. Or if you put them in the chat, also use the Q&A feature, because we will try to get to those at the end of the conversation. And if you put them in the chat, they'll get buried. We are recording this, as you know, and we will be sharing the recording once we're done via email. And also, we have an ASL interpreter joining us. Dalton is here. If you need interpretation, there's a button at the bottom of the screen. Select American Sign Language, and you should be good to go. So with that, we'll get started. I'm very pleased to have Jen Pahlka with us. As I mentioned, Jen and I used to work together at Code for America. Jen founded and ran Code for America for many years. And actually, the first year that I started there, I think I started in February, and maybe a month, I showed up and Jen said, "Hey, good to see you. I'm actually going to bounce to DC for a year." I got asked to go help the White House do some of the stuff that we're doing at Code for America. And that is a lot of the experience that is reflected in Recoding America. And Jen has been working on making government services work better for people ever since. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Jen, if I didn't say enough of your background, but also just to introduce the book and the thesis of the book, but also why you wrote it and what you are hoping people take away from it. Oh, you're on mute.
I made a joke like, nice to see you, Kathy, but so. But thank you for having me. This is great to be here with you guys. Let's see. I think you've covered my background. I like to introduce myself now as just simply a book author, since I'm first time I've done this, and it's new and fun. I will maybe just dive in a little bit to sort of the key thesis of the book. It's got this flag and a QR code on the cover, so everyone thinks it's about technology. It's got technology in it, but it's really about government, and it's about how I think the core dysfunction I'm trying to diagnose here, which I kind of see through the lens of technology, but not stopping at the technology, is the way that we have separated the ideas of policy from their implementation. And by pulling those two things apart, we have a whole host of sort of bad outcomes, including just the fact that we're not learning as we go, right? The policy is not learning from its implementation, and that becomes a really big problem. Why I wrote the book, I have spent, let's not say how many years recently, with people who do digital service delivery for the public within government, and maybe more than service delivery. And there's been a huge change in the approach to that is, a change I see as extremely positive. But the people doing that work are now at the point where they are just held back by the environment in which they're doing it. We need to start educating those who are not the folks building the, snap interfaces or, working on the immigration systems, and start educating those who are creating the conditions under which it's so hard to do that work. So I'm just basically trying to get the message out a little broader and explain why it's about a lot more than technology, and that we're not going to make government work just by pushing on the technology. We've got to push on the culture and the way that our leaders think about this problem.
Yeah, and when I was reading the book, I was trying to channel somebody who, and when I was at Code for America, in fairness to me, I wasn't, my job was not to be connected directly to government services. I was working more with community members who wanted to be engaged. So I was reading this a little bit with fresh eyes. And, I think it is true that many citizens or residents don't think of there being a distinction between policy and implementation. So it might be helpful to talk about an example. You have a lot of examples in the book, and I don't know which one you think is the most relevant. Maybe EDD, since I think we probably have a lot of California people on the call, but maybe just give an example of how what you're talking about when you say that policy is disconnected from implementation.
Well, I would say I think that the average person doesn't really think that much about policy. They experience delivery, and but when we're governing and we're trying to build a government, we think that policy is the end of the line, and it isn't, or at least it's the most important part of the line. So examples of disjunctures, as you mentioned, during the pandemic, we changed the policy to allow for more people to get unemployment insurance and get higher amounts. And the existing policy, was there as well. And then we didn't deliver. Prior to that, some of the work at Code for America, that's a really good example. When states started legalizing marijuana, you had people who still had felonies on their records. And of course, it's very hard to live under the burden of a felony, especially for something that is no longer a crime. And the law allowed for expungement of that past felony, but the implementation of it was sort of zero. And so here you have thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people across the state who are supposed to get this thing removed from their record so that they can get jobs and public housing and all of these different things that are kept from them while they have this felony record, and yet nothing happens. So we have this, it's in the news, this thing has happened, and there's a promise that's made. The promise isn't delivered on. And that's what I mean about the disjuncture between policy and implementation. And I think it's actually a much bigger problem than convenience, we have trouble at the DMV or whatever. It is fundamental break in the promise of government, and it is actually hurting our ability to have a functioning democracy as people are less and less confident that government can do anything.
Yeah, can you just put a finer point on that? Because I think, when we think about services don't work, and obviously healthcare.gov is probably the most high profile example of this, and you talk about it a lot in the book. The obvious bad outcome from that is that people can't sign up for health insurance, but it is also that it undermines our faith in our democracy and our ability of our government to actually serve the people. And also, I think you articulated well. I was going to ask you, what is the role of technology in this story? I read it as one role being that, the way we experience technology in our everyday lives is getting further and further away from how it mediates our experience with government, and that disconnect is also sort of increasing our sense of mistrust in government. So I don't know if you want to say more about that, but really just putting a finer point on the fact that this is undermining the health of our democracy as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think one way to put that is the widening gap between what you experience in the public sector and what you experience as a private citizen with, the convenience that is now available to us in the world is troubling. And we really need to close that gap in order to keep people's trust and faith. But sort of an insider look at it, what is the role of technology? Well, I feel like when I started the book, I didn't quite know how to explain this. And it was some of what I learned about sort of the history of technology and government taught me that technology has been sort of pushed away as a detail of implementation that other people will handle for a very long time, not just because it's tech and tech is scary to people, but because it is implementation, and implementation has been pushed away. So, I tell the story in the book about in 1995, when two members of Congress decided to ask the Office of Management and Budget to take responsibility for digital strategy. It's hard to remember 1995. Maybe some of the people on this call weren't even alive then, but this was a time when Amazon and Google were sort of, baby companies. It was just starting to be clear that this was no longer about the personal computer revolution, but it was the internet was fundamentally going to change how we live. And so I think they were prescient in asking for, the highest, the most elite part of our government to take charge of this. And the response from the Office of Management and Budget, the deputy director, was no, thank you. That's not ours. And what he says in testimony is that is operational in nature and therefore inconsistent with the policy role of this institution. He's basically saying, we do policy. That's what's important. GSA, who buys pencils and and cars and stuff. By the way, of course, GSA does so much more now. They're a very critical part of this ecosystem with the Technology Transformation Service and 18F. But at the time, they were that's GSA's problem. This is just about buying computers. And it was extremely short-sighted, but it comes from this really deep part of our culture, which I think is sort of an elitist part of our culture, to be honest. And you can trace it back to the British civil service, of course, which we borrow a lot from, in which they literally divide people between the civil servants, between the intellectuals and the mechanicals. And the policymakers are intellectuals and the people who do delivery are mechanicals. And there are very different rules for those groups of people. And we try not to give the people who do the mechanicals, who do delivery, much room for judgment. And that is hurting us terribly as it relates to delivering for people in terms of our policies.
So let's talk about how that manifests. And you describe it, I would say, you say as the waterfall problem. I'm wondering if you can just tell folks what the waterfall is, how it works, and then maybe, use an example of how it functions in practice. I think the example of the woman who ran EDD in California as a good example of like what happens to people in that system.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people here will be familiar with waterfall as a description of a software development methodology, which it is, but I'm using it in the book more as a metaphor for the culture of government. Waterfall software development fits very well in government because government has this hierarchy in which things start at the top with the policy and they, descend through this hierarchy to the delivery people. And there's no way for the delivery people to talk to the policy people. I'll tell the ADD story briefly, but, for those of us, I think some people here were kind of around in the early days of Code for America. One of the first projects we did in Boston was about this school assignment thing. And it's funny because I didn't really get how separated policy and implementation were, because my first experiences working with government, we had our fellows, coding applications like this, way for parents to figure out which schools their kids were eligible to go to, sitting right next to the policy people. And so when they did a first version of this website to help parents find the schools, immediately it comes up like, oh, wait, there's questions here. Is it supposed to be, it was designed to allow more kids to walk to school. So there was this walk zone idea. And it was like immediately like, oh, wait, do we mean that the school is supposed to be less than 1.5 miles from the house as the crow flies, or by city streets? Oh, Joel Mahoney can just turn to the policy guide next to him and say, or person, and say, hey, I think we should adjust the policy so that we're not sending kids, across Boston Bay, to walk to school. And you had this, incredible back and forth, sort of an ongoing dialogue between policy and delivery. You look at, so it's not separate. You look at something like EDD and you see, essentially, while we're there, we find out that all of the people, the 5,000 people that we have hired to help clear this backlog of unemployment insurance claims during the late summer of that first year of the pandemic, moved from 1995 to like July, August, September 2000, when shutdown had happened, people had lost their jobs, they needed their unemployment insurance claims, and they weren't, lots of them did get it, but many people were still waiting 3, 4, and 5 months later without a check. Is devastating to their livelihoods and in some cases their lives. And, one of the things we found out going in there was that because it takes 17 years, I'm not making that number up, to learn how to be a claims processor, the fact that the state had hired all of these people to help with claims processing, but they couldn't do the job. They could only take away the time of the claims processors. Then every person we hired was actually slowing claims processing. And when it became my job to deliver this news to the head of the EDD at the time, her response was, that's nice, but I can't do anything about that. I've been told to hire people. The governor, the legislature, the press has all gone out there saying that this is the solution to the problem. But, so I cannot go contradict them. In my view, we just given her the solution to the problem. In her view, I had the permission to sort of speak up the waterfall, but she did not. She was a career public servant who meant very well and was trying to do her best, but was really operating within this metaphorical waterfall in which she was sort of not allowed to push these insights and information back up the chain in order to make something happen.
Yeah, so just, I guess some background for people who haven't read the book is you were detailed to, I don't know, there was a new commission, or you got detailed to EDD after it became clear that there was waste, fraud, and abuse, and people weren't getting their people who were deserving of benefits weren't getting them.
They didn't really know about the fraud yet. We kind of found out while we were there. They knew that people weren't getting their benefits because people were calling, they couldn't call EDD, so they called their state legislative offices 24/7. And it was very overwhelmingly clear that a lot of people were not getting served. And it's funny, this isn't in the book, but like, yeah, EDD is the acronym for Employment Development Department. It's part of the labor agency in the state of California that delivers unemployment insurance. Sorry, that's in the chat there. Normal times, it would have been like this whole paperwork process for me to get detailed, as you say. This literally was like a call from somebody in the governor's office, this, that, and the other. And then I started working. There was zero paperwork at all. They called it a strike team. I really don't like that term. It feels like someone's about to strike somebody. So I always refer to it as a task force. But the Secretary of Government Operations, Yolanda Richardson, and I were the chairs of this task force, and I brought some other folks in, and it was incredibly lightweight and paper-free because we were in a crisis.
Yeah, so I mean, the stories of people within the waterfall, and I think understanding the incentives, like what they're responding to, because it's not really irrational when you think about it from like within the system that they're working in, the system that, spoiler alert, we all are complicit in having created.
Indeed.
The head of the department saying to you, like, yeah, I kind of know, or thanks for telling me that this is like me hiring new people is actually making it worse, but like, I'm not accountable to the outcomes. I'm accountable to the person that's like one layer ahead of me on the waterfall saying, you have to hire new people. And frankly, residents of California were yelling at the governor saying, why don't you have more people to process the claims? So in fairness to everybody, it was kind of, the call was coming from inside the house. But also she's not, her accountability structure is not tied to actual outcomes of the program. So you can just talk about like in her mind, or in people like her, what is she scared of? What incentives is she responding to? And how does that contribute to the problem?
I think all public servants are stuck in an accountability trap where their career advancement very often depends on being able to show that they have followed established processes, but those processes are often at odds with the actual outcome. And they're also, of course, expected to get the outcome, but you kind of very often can't do both. And so, the book is really full of stories of people who choose the process and those who choose the outcome. And I really try not to judge those who choose the process. It is a very rational choice. But I am also trying to celebrate those who decide to work through those process constraints in sort of dogged, persistent pursuit of getting the outcome for people. To stay on the negative for a second, I mean, a good example of this is this guy who was a senior leader at the Veterans Administration back in 2014 when I was still working in the White House and sort of doing these, what we call discovery sprints, to sort of show what would become the USDS, what that unit would do, the kinds of projects it would take on and how it would work. And there was a problem with the Veterans Benefit Management System. It was very, very slow. I wonder how slow it is today. I don't actually know that. But turned out that the guy, we found out later that the guy had sort of defined the problem away. His first thing to me was, thanks for sending people to verify that everything's okay. Everything was okay because he defined latency as 2 minutes. So if you clicked on a link and waited 1 minute and 59 seconds, you were not to report latency. But, as we're talking to this guy and, I keep saying, well, why did you make this choice? And, how did you do this? Why does it do this and not this? He kept deferring over and over again. You'll have to ask the program people. You'll have to ask the procurement people. You'll have to ask so-and-so. And when I finally pushed him on it, said, why are you deferring? He said, oh, I've spent my career teaching my folks not to have an opinion on business requirements. If they ask us to build a concrete boat, we'll build a concrete boat. And he's not wrong. I mean, that literally, in a certain interpretation of the structures and rules of government, that is the job of the tech team, to just do what they're told, even if The steps before that have been, a process that allows everybody and their mother to throw, requirements into a bucket, and you end up with a set of requirements that is undifferentiated, extremely large, unprioritized, and has no product vision, and you just deliver on that. That's how we get concrete boats. And yeah, that is kind of his job. So when we see people doing very active product management, like Yadira Sanchez, who's somebody I talk about at the end of the book, who's very bold and sort of the opposite of this VA guy, they are choosing to do so in a way that's like, yeah, a lot of people say that's not your job. You're out of your lane. But we need people to be out of their lane.
Yeah, and I guess it's not just how they are rewarded. So, I mean, I think there, and you can actually tell me, like in the civil service codes or whatever, like how you move to the next level or get a promotion is not necessarily based on the outcomes of the program that you're working on. But also, there's the negative incentive too. So for the woman who ran EDD, she's worried about having to get called in front of the, Senate, whatever oversight committee, and having to defend herself. And she's thinking, well, if I follow the protocol, then I get to say that in the committee hearing. If I don't, then I'm in trouble, because what I'm supposed to do is follow the protocol. So it's like I think these stories explained it really well in the book, of like how the thought process, how they're incentivized by the structure they're in within this waterfall system to do the thing that doesn't seem rational to us on the outside. So before we get to like what we do about it, and I think there's a category of actors there that I want to talk about. I do think it's important to tell the story about Yadira, because there are people in government who are doing it well, and it's not just the people who came from the private sector to like save healthcare.gov. There are people who are in government who want to be entrepreneurial, and for whom, if there were different pathways, we could like activate them to be empowered. So can you just tell people who she is and how she embodies what change you want to see in the system?
Yeah, Yadira came to Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It was her first job. She was recruited from her hometown, San Juan in Puerto Rico, came to Baltimore. She'd been there for several years when healthcare.gov launched and had its troubles, as we like to say. It did do well by the end of the open enrollment period, and we'd like to remind people of that. And exactly right, she was one of the key people who got it up and running again. She knew CMS very well. She was incredibly creative. She'd sort of always been doing, I think, sort of agile development. But she told me that until she met the quote unquote rescue team, not a great term, but much like a strike force, strike team, she never heard the word agile development. She never heard about user-centered design. She grew up in this very legacy, traditional government IT environment, but I think to give her credit, she was already practicing those things in her own way. Like when she was responsible for training, for instance, she would ask the people in her trainings, what features do you use and what ones don't you use, and try to use that feedback to improve the products that she was training them on. But then she gets exposed to the idea that like agile development is a thing and user-centered design is a thing that's a legitimate framework for approaching her work. And so after healthcare.gov, she and many others at CMS are determined that the next big initiative they get, the next big law that they have to implement, will go better. And that next law is the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act of 2015, otherwise known as MACRA. And the thing about MACRA is it's designed to pay doctors better for better quality care. In other words, to improve the quality of care that Medicare patients get. And the problem is that doctors are already so frustrated with Medicare. They already have to submit their quality data. It's incredibly frustrating. They feel it's like, putting something into a black hole. They don't know till a year later if they did it right. The EHR, electronic healthcare records software they have to buy is very expensive. They have to train their staff. And the only thing they hate more than the way they do it now is the idea that they're going to have to learn another way. And they assume that way will also be awful. And so Yadira and her team know that the way to make macro work isn't just like the site has to be up, right? And more than 8 people have to be able to use it at the same time. It has to not frustrate doctors. One of the first things they're asked to do is, explain to doctors how this is going to work. Okay, the first thing we need doctors to tell us is, are you a sole practitioner or are you a medical group or in a medical group? And yet there are 9 different definitions of a medical group. So from the first moment, they are going to drive doctors insane with pages of legalese, and they're just going to lose people. And by the way, what's going to happen is that doctors will stop taking Medicare. You can just opt out. And especially in rural areas, if that's what this program does, and you have doctors dropping their patients, you're kind of by default decreasing the quality of care, not increasing it. So you have the, classic implementation gap. Says one thing, what happens is the exact opposite. So, like I said, they're out of their lane. They say, I know that what we're supposed to do is just like you gave me the requirements, I fulfill the requirements. We've got to write something that shows the 9 different definitions of the group, but they don't. They say, we've got to have a dialogue with the policy team, and we've got to resolve those 9 different definitions down into one. They get from 9 to 2. Not 1, but it's still so much better. They continue to fight these fights. It's maybe not the right word, but they continue to have these dialogues with the folks, like the fact that doctors are supposed to, who take very few Medicare patients, are supposed to be exempt. That's written into the law. But the way that the regulators within the agency have interpreted the law is that they'll make everybody go through the program for the first year. And at the end, they'll look at the data and decide who is exempt, and then they'll exempt those folks. So that's a set of doctors who by default are going to drop out. And Yadira says, you can't do that. We have to just look at last year's data and exempt these folks so they don't have to invest in this new software. And the line that Natalie Cates and Yadira kind of use over and over again here is, I get that it's complicated, but it has to make sense to a person. And it's that kind of like getting out of their lane that is responsible, I think, for the implementation of MACRA being a huge success. It ships on time, under budget, and the doctors are really happy and they don't leave Medicare.
Yeah, and Yadira, I mean, there's on the one hand and on the other hand here about the prospects for solving this problem. Like when I started reading the book, it was honestly like physically overwhelming. Like we're never going to get anywhere with this. But then reading stories like that, I'm like, oh my God, the fix is just so easy. Like people just need to be like Yadira. And they don't even need like new skills. Not new technical skills, I guess I would say.
And it's not that she learned some new programming language. She's just
right. She was dogged and resilient and enterprising. And she and Natalie were like, well, I'm just going to go ask the person who wrote the policy what they meant. And the fact that no one has been like, well, let me just go ask the people who wrote the law what they meant.
Because they're in a waterfall.
Is kind of crazy. It's like, what if everybody just did that? That seems like an easy solution to this problem. So
you're bringing up something important, which is the one criticism I've gotten in the book, which I think is fair, is that you can read it as simply a celebration of people who, color outside the lines in the way that Yadira does. That's not a systemic solution. That is just asking people to be braver. And you need to actually change the system so that you have more incentives for people to be like her. You're never going to get rid of that distinction. I mean, some people are going to be more timid and some people are going to be really self-empowered and creative the way that Yadira is. But we can't have a system that relies on heroism for every outcome.
I mean, it's only heroic because she's not rewarded based. I mean, if the systemic change is to reward people for the outcomes of the program and not for following the process, right? And I mean, I don't know that there's any I can't imagine there's an elected official in the world, let alone the US, who, is going to get mad that someone followed the process but had a better policy outcome, like more people were served for less money and faster. Like they're not going to come down on that person, right? So if you have more examples of like, this worked, it was cheaper, and it is actually a better service, and we have more trust, then the lesson is, okay, that's actually, I get a reward for doing it that way. It's not against the rules. That starts to then make changing the system a little bit easier, I guess would be my response, but I get what you're saying. Okay, I do want to talk about actors here, and I'm going to list the actors, and we're probably not going to get out to all of them, but I just want to say them. So, I mean, I think that there are companies, sort of government contractors who are players in this that have an interesting role to play. There are, and this is the one I actually want to start with, so we'll come back to it, is advocates and advocacy organizations.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who work in government today. There are, I think, I don't know that you don't really touch on this in the book. I think there's one story about the media journalists, like you mentioned, how would journalists have told this story? I think they play a critical role, and then the role they play is critical because it's how the rest of us understand what's actually happening and decide what to care about. So that's the last thing, is like people, and that I would split that into like technologists or people with this set of skills and just everyday citizens. So let's start with the advocates. My sin, that I'm going to kind of soapbox on this for a minute. There's a reason that we added implementation and enforcement into our theory of change, because we've been engaged in a lot of policy advocacy fights, and many of our partners are done when the law passes, and they're not really, I wouldn't say they're not engaged with what happens in the aftermath, but it is not a conscious thing that they're thinking about how the agencies that are responsible for doing the thing are going to implement this. And I had a conversation with a government official who will remain nameless at a department that was responsible for implementing a law that we've been trying to get passed for literal years. And this particular department keeps killing it in, kind of behind the scenes by attaching this crazy price tag to the thing. And it's like really not, in my mind, it's a Google form and a spreadsheet, and they're saying it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars. And I actually talked to
the legislative analyst's office is saying it'll cost this much, which means the bill won't pass, is what you're saying.
Right. They were saying that because they talked to the department, who said it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars to do and take like 60 people. And, I talked to somebody in the department, and their frustration is you're in the bill negotiation conversation, not thinking at all about what it's going to mean for us when we actually have to take this law. Like, we get dozens of laws every year at the end of every year, and they just get dumped on us, and we're told to figure out how to make them work. And you don't have one thought about that when you're actually writing the law. And that's a fair critique. So I guess, what would you say to advocacy organizations, and what advice would you give to us as we embark on this implementation journey? How should we do that work?
It's such a good question. Sorry, so many things come up for me in that. And there's so many examples of this. If you read the book, there's the Clear My Record story, this records clearance stuff, where that exact thing happened to these automatic expungement laws. For a while, they got killed because they got these huge price tags on them. But also you have this issue of like, so much money got spent on the passage of the law, and no one was really following up to see that people's actual records got expunged. I think that the advice to advocates, if I can cut through just like a whole jumble of stuff in my mind, because it's such an under-discussed topic, I'm really glad you brought it up, is you kind of have to do the same user research that service delivery people do. You have to really, advocates are supposed to understand this from the bottom up, but they often don't. They're still seeing it a little bit from the top down. They're seeing it from a policy level, not an implementation level. And of course, as they say in the book, you can't celebrate when the law is passed. I mean, you can celebrate as like, yay, we got the first step of this done, but it is the first step, not the last step. The other thing, getting back to this user research thing, let me see if I can bring that to life a little bit. I think it was Dave Garino, or one of the folks on the Get CalFresh team when I worked at Code for America, who told me this. Like, they would make me every once in a while go apply for government benefits. Like, it's great thing for people to make you do. Like, totally brings to life what the actual burden is like. And I remember getting through the very end of the My Benefits CalWin application, which is the sort of legacy way that you would apply for SNAP in San Francisco and 17 other counties. And at the end of it, there's this form that you get to that's supposed to get you to be registered to vote. And from a policy and advocacy level, it makes perfect sense. You want more low-income people registered to vote, put it in this workflow that they have, this process that they have of getting SNAP, because they're by definition low income. But if you actually do the application, you will see exactly what's going on there. This doesn't exist anymore, so you can't see it now. You have all of this language in SNAP trying to tell people that it is okay if you are not a documented citizen, you can still get SNAP. And then and it's all of this language is very legalese and very confusing. And then right at the end, there's this form about registering to vote, where guess what? You absolutely have to be a citizen. And there's a bunch of legalese about how you're going to go to frickin' jail if you click on this part of it. Well, suddenly all these people who maybe they're undocumented, maybe they have undocumented people in their family, maybe this just like brings up a lot of stuff for them because there's like all these flags that you're going to go to jail. Suddenly they abandon the entire application, including the SNAP. It's not a great idea from an implementation standpoint. Sounds like a good idea from an advocacy standpoint. And until advocates spend more time on implementation, they're not going to see that they often advocate for the wrong thing. And I don't think tech equity does that. I'm just saying some people do.
I mean, I'm open to the criticism. I think, one thing that's in my mind right now, which is very in the news, is regulations around automated decision-making systems and AI, which we will be working on. And the story around Clear My Record was very jumped out at me when I was reading that, and this idea that that is AI. I mean, it's an automated decision-making tool in some ways, where it's going through and automatically expunging people's records. And I could see a set of advocates being being very suspicious of that and wanting to put more guardrails around it in such a way that unintentionally makes it harder for people's records to get cleared. So, I mean, I think that's important for all of us to be aware of.
Clear My Record, just to be really clear, is definitely not AI. It's been called an algorithm, but it's basically some if-then statements.
I think it would meet a definition of an automated decision-making tool.
That's different from AI, though. Automated decision and AI are two different things. They can cross over.
Well, they aren't they're being lumped together in this conversation about regulating algorithmic based tools. So there is a bill that is, I think passed, somebody can correct me, that the state now has to catalog all of their automated decision-making tools. And, I know that there's talk in advocate circles around just being generally suspicious of those things. So it's just something to keep in mind as we have that conversation. Yes, we want people not to be mistreated by these things, but also let's make sure we're not having unintended harms.
That's true in so many areas. I mean, you're absolutely right that the caution around AI, which is totally merited, is going to create a net in which a bunch of very positive developments are going to get caught. And I could talk a little bit more about that, but it's very, very hard in a world where we're not distinguishing between very innocuous uses of AI and for pro-social justice uses of AI, and generally this idea that we have a lot of anxiety about decisions being made automatically. It's just a hard problem, but some more nuanced dialogue would be helpful.
Yeah, and talking to the people who are actually going to implement the policies that we're trying to write would be helpful part of that process. Okay, so I want to get to Q&A because we already have 10 questions in there. I'm going to invite Marion back, who's our director of comms, who has been monitoring the Q&A. Marion, what do you have for us?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for this discussion. It's been so fun to listen to. And thank you to everyone in the chat and the Q&A who've been asking such thoughtful questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So I'm going to start with, there's a couple of questions in here that I'm going to lump together. You talked a lot about, all of the heroes of government who've been trying to focus more on the outcomes rather than the process, and do these very inventive ways of making those outcomes happen. But as you said, like that isn't really necessarily a systemic solution. So could you speak a little bit more to how we can make these siloed government agencies speak to each other more effectively? And then for those that are in that space, in the governmental space, how can they help to work towards those solutions?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, the answer sounds awful and is sort of hopeless, which is like change the culture. I don't think you change culture by trying to change culture. You change culture by changing behavior, right? And there's a line, I think this is Eric Liu, is like, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. Like, we all have to remember our part in it, whether it's as citizens or as public servants, that, there are little ways in which we can support, when someone like Yadira says, hey, let's fight this, and say we're not going to make them go through the program and only to find out that they're exempt. How do we support that person? And you see it in your life, like someone's like, oh no, we'll get in trouble for that. Like, instead of saying, I can see why that's risky, but that's a good idea, right? It's just like little ways that we can support each other. The silo thing is challenging. I guess one of the things I want to say is, I get a lot of questions like this that are like, what can we do? And it's not that we, as I know a lot of people on here are public servants. It's not that we as public servants, or if you are a public servant, don't have a role to play, right? Remember that you are traffic. Remember that you have a voice. Find people to support, create community. Most people like Yadira continue doing what they do because they have community supporting them. And because they're very passionate about the outcome. They're constantly focused on their goal. Her goal in life is to make healthcare better in this country. But I really wrote the book not because I want to keep telling people in public service what to do. Like, they know what to do. I wrote the book because our elected leaders need to change something. And I wrote the book because we have a role in pivoting pivoting is not the right word. We have a role in editing what it is that the people we vote for and donate to their campaigns do. So my metaphor for this, and it gets a little bit to this issue of like what anybody can do, any, as you said earlier, average person can do. Our elected leaders think that they're gardeners. Their job is to plant a seed in the soil, and then whatever grows, whether it's a flower or a plant, like if it gives us shade or flowers or whatever, that's what they get elected for. But we're planting seeds and they're not growing. That's the whole point of the book. We have this gap. Gardeners don't just plant seeds, they tend the soil. And that is what we are not doing. We're trying to extract more and more out of the soil of our government without actually investing in the public service, in reducing old regulations, in unburdening public servants, in hiring and training them. And until the average person, when someone asks for their dollar or their vote, says, I know we need to have a values match here, that's step one. But step two is, I need to know how you're tending the soil, because I think that's part of your job. Until we all start doing that, there's not going to be any change. Excuse me.
Catherine, were you trying to get in there, or should I?
No, I was waiting for you to get the next.
Sweet. Well, I guess people, you've already kind of touched on this just now, but other people in the chat have been asking, how do we get these policymakers to engage with implementation, to engage with tech? Yeah, that's my question.
I mean, people will tell you it's quite hard to get policymakers to pay attention. I think we're getting better at it. There's a story in the book about, sorry, I guess I got excited and hopped a little. There's a story in the book about Emily Tavaleris and Marion Birdie showing the Deputy Secretary of the Veterans Administration this video of Dominic, a veteran who's been trying to apply for veterans benefits. And it's not like it's easy to get in front of the Deputy Secretary, but I will say we very often do have our shot in front of someone powerful. And we try to speak for people instead of letting our users speak for themselves. And that moment of Sloan Gibson, the DepSec, watching this video of Dominic for the 15th time or 200th time trying to get veterans benefits and not being able to even open the application and sort of joking about it. You know, he's so human, he's so funny, he's so accessible, and he's so pissed off, as he should be. You know, it just opens up the VA, which has now been in a 10-year transformation journey. And it really does sort of go back to that moment of, you know, Dominic wasn't physically there in front of the Deputy Secretary, but they brought him and his voice there. And I think we should, as practitioners, we should do more of that. But again, back to what I said before about what we ask our elected leaders, like we aren't all just advocates or public servants or media or contractors to government. We are all also voters and citizens. And there are 2 million public servants in this country. That's actually constituency for what I would call state capacity. That is the constituency for, you can't just plant seeds, you've got to tend the soil.
So can I want to jump in there with this question about the media, because, you know, that's how we understand. I mean, they're setting the agenda for us, right? So to your point about, I think it was the MACRA site, which ended up actually being really great. And actually, I did see some reporting that said, that we have bent the healthcare cost curve, which is something elected officials have been talking about for my entire lifetime of trying to do, right? And they were like, well, there's many reasons for this, one of which is that we have values-based care now. And there was really no discussion of the fact that like there was this process in the background that Yadira was really a champion of to make the site work so that doctors actually used it, so that now doctors are incentivized to provide values-based care. And we've bent the cost curve. So like in a lot of ways, that feels to me like a failure of journalism to not tell that part of the story when we talk about a policy success. So I don't know, do you have thoughts about the media's role in all of this?
I have more questions than answers, but I think about it a lot. I've had a number of really interesting outreaches from the book. And one of them is a guy who runs a prize for journalists covering government. And he read the book and he was like, I am starting to see the ways in which the classic frame that media uses, waste, fraud, and abuse, actually kind of is outdated. Like there's a bunch of ways that sort of pushes, it can push on that accountability framework in a negative way. It can go back to, you're going to get in trouble because you didn't check this box. You hired a contractor with not enough specificity in the RFP, for instance, which drives again towards these concrete votes, these 6,700 requirements. Like if that's what the media think gets us, is the right thing for government folks to do, there's continues to be fear of media oversight that's going to drive risk-averse behavior. I will say, so he wants to be engaged in this conversation about how they might change their award to reward different kinds of reporting. The obvious thing is exactly what you said, like, why don't you tell good stories, right? But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. And it also is part of a larger thing. I've like 3 big things at the end of the book that I bring up: funding, talent, and oversight. So oversight can be media, it can be Office of Inspector General, it can be the GAO, it can be congressional hearing, it can be a whole ton of things. The way we practice all of that oversight now increases risk aversion. We have to rethink oversight broadly in such a way that it honors people like Yadira. One of the things I always say is like, you have Yadira not just doing what I told, but like there's this thing at the end where she literally not ignores. She is told to do these data extracts, and instead she does an API. So like in a strict, narrow sense, she did not do what Congress asked her to do. She did what Congress intended, but not actually what they wrote. And so if we want behavior like that, why isn't a good half of our oversight muscle spent saying that's what good looks like? What Yadira did is excellent, yay, instead of 100% of it being your JIRA thing was misconfigured and you have a security flaw here and you didn't check that box. Like, of course we have a risk-averse culture. We create it through our oversight structures and other things.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the EDD woman who, you know, she's getting screamed at by senators who are reading the LA Times article about how EDD is not hiring people fast enough, right? So like that's where that comes from to a large extent. Marion.
Oh, I think there's time for maybe one more question. Yeah. So when you were talking about, I feel like that your metaphor of lawmakers and policymakers thinking that they're gardeners who plant seeds, but we need to edit the way that they work such that they're tilling the land, they're tending to the seeds that they're trying to grow. What are some actionable ways that everyday citizens can start to edit that role?
I think that this is something I would invite everybody in the call to think about and share your ideas, because I don't think we know yet. But I don't know how many of you like go to events with candidates, but ask those questions. Elected leaders are extremely responsive to the questions people ask. Not that they can do anything about them, but they start to think about them. There's part of my message is to, the elite donors to whom politicians pay far more attention. But let's start with just, show up at a candidate forum and ask it, right? Send in your questions, and make sure that if you have a values match, that those values are actually put into action.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could all write to your local congressperson or whatever and just ask them if they've read this book. I mean, I think just putting it on their agenda is a really important and powerful move. And to, the point that you made about EDD earlier, the only reason we kind of found out that it wasn't working or it became this huge stink is that a bunch of people were calling their representatives and being like, I can't get unemployment benefits. So they do respond in that sense. They may not like write back to you with an answer, but they start to take that on as part of how they think about their ability to get reelected or being responsive to their constituents. And I also think for anybody out there who, has tech skills and tech or tech adjacent skills, Jen makes a really powerful case in the book to really consider bringing your professional skills and talent to government. You don't have to work there forever. You don't have to be Yadira and a career public servant, but any time spent there is good time spent. And it starts to build a culture that this is like, we are not separated from this, institution that is really the basis of our, the strength of our democracy. So
can I just add to that very briefly? It's also thought a lot of giving back. Like, I've done well in my career, I'm going to give back. You actually get a lot. Like, talk to anybody when they come out of public service. It's an incredibly rewarding job, even though it's difficult. And I feel like I got more than I gave. And I know that's true of a lot of people.
Yeah. And I, with that, I will say, I know that there's a lot of people on who are working in government, either who are career civil servants or who are doing a tour of duty from the tech sector. And, you're the heroes of this story. You're being the change we want to see in the world. So thank you for your service. And with that, we'll sign off. You'll see a recording of this in your inbox, and we hope that you will share it and that you will buy the book if you haven't already. All right. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.